Good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Saturday Matters. And we all know Lowell, and we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say. One of the best things a young person can do is go out and see the world. And Lowell did that. One of the worst things that an old person can do is tell long, boring stories, but we're not going to hear that from Lowell.
I'll do the best I can.
That's why when you're young, you collect a lot of interesting things to talk about. Okay, go ahead, Lowell.
Okay, thanks very much. This kind of grew out of the fact that when I put a collage of ephemera that I collected on my trip up during the art show the last time, several people, I mean probably two, were kind of interested in the background, where that stuff came from. So today what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about what led to the trip, or some of the precipitating events for the trip, and then today get as far as Australia and wander quite a bit around Australia. I just noticed on the way down that in the elevator, the announcement from Life Enrichment says, the culture and wildlife of Australia. So let me just preface my remarks that I was there 60 years ago. The culture consisted of bars or pubs, and the wildlife consisted of beaches. And so I'll show you some of the wildlife and some of the culture of Australia. So the background to this was that I graduated high school in 1957. Immediately after graduating from high school, I went to work as an orderly in a local hospital. In the fall, I started community college. I had no money, and I wasn't smart enough to get into a college with a scholarship. So I went to community college, continued to work at nights or in the evening as an orderly when I was going to college. Sometime around early in the middle of my first year, I started not feeling well. And I was working and I was going to school full time. And so I said, maybe I'd find out what was going on. Well, to make a long story very short, I spent some time on bed rest, some time with restricted diet, some time in the hospital. And I was diagnosed with acute glomerular nephritis. That's a very bad kidney disease. I finally was able to get back to work, start school the next fall, continued in school, and sometime that second year, my internist said to me, he said, you know, Lowell, you can't pass the medical school physical exam. He says, in fact, you couldn't even pass a physical if you didn't become Scout or Boy Scouts. Well, needless to say, that was a bit upsetting. And some people, the diagnosis had changed from acute nephritis to chronic nephritis. That's what people have kidney transplants for and dialysis. This was before either of those were available. So I had a really crappy prognosis. And unlike people who deal well with bad news, I dealt with it really poorly. It really bothered me and upset me. It had negative impacts on relationships with people and so on. So basically, I decided after the end of my second year of college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. You know, I was told I couldn't be a doctor. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I applied to pharmacy school, got accepted, and about 3 weeks before pharmacy school started, the local urologist who I worked with from when I was an orderly said, I'm looking for a technician. And I said, okay, well, I'm not sure I want to be a pharmacist. So I went to work with him as a technician. I did x-rays, I scrubbed in surgery, I worked in the office as a nurse, and basically did that. And then I realized after about a year that I wasn't really cut out to be a technician. As some of you may know, I wasn't a good technician. I was actually a good technician, but I wasn't cut out for it. So I decided, okay, I got to do something else. What am I going to do? And I said, well, I don't know, maybe I'll go to Australia. This makes absolutely no sense now, and I'm not sure how it happened then. So I decided to migrate to Australia. I I went through the process, got a migrant's visa, and decided, okay, I'm going to Australia. Some of this grew out of the movie The Sundowners, which has lots of sheep and mountains, and it's quite gorgeous. So anyhow, I went to Australia, and I left on a cold, rainy Seattle November day. I had a one-way ticket on a freighter to Singapore, and a migrant's visa to Australia, and here's that story.
Are you a technician?
It worked before. There we go. Let's try this. And if you somebody turn off the lights. So basically, today I'm going to talk about going. I'm sorry. I'm up there really quick story. I'm going to talk about going from here to here to here to here to here, and then all over here. So as I said, I left Seattle. This is the freighter that I left on. In those days, freighters took paying passengers up to 12. After about 12, you had to have a medical officer. There were 6 of us on board. And my folks took me to the ship, waved goodbye to me, and off I went. Our first stop was Port Alice, BC, which is on the Pacific Ocean side of Vancouver Island. We were there for 3 days loading paper. What you see in the picture is a paper mill. If you've ever been around a paper mill, you know that they stink. And I had no idea how people lived there, because every so often they would have a major release of sulfur dioxide, and it was terrible, but I survived it. So from there, we went north, past the Aleutians, and if you've ever traveled in the Pacific in the winter, the seas are very heavy. This shows a picture of the typical seas that we encountered. One of the things that was bad about that was it was incredibly rough. There were a couple of days we couldn't go on board, but one day it was very rough. One of the passengers, there was a woman on the board who was walking down one of the hallways, and a large door, a heavy bulkhead door, slammed on her fingers. I was basically the one who knew first aid. I took care of her. But what that did was made us have to have a stop unscheduled in Yokohama so that she could get medical help. We stayed in Yokohama. We didn't go off the ship. She did, but we didn't. Our first real stop was Hong Kong. And this shows you Hong Kong in the 1960s. It doesn't look that way anymore. At that time, it was still a British Crown colony. They had not gained their independence. We spent 3 days there. We were there an extra day because of typhoons in the Pacific between where we were and where we were going. This shows a typical Hong Kong street street scene in the 60s. It was, as I say, a British colony at that time. Our destination was Singapore. Well, Singapore was a little different then than it is now. Singapore and Malaysia had gained their independence from Britain in 1967 or 57, and this was 1962. And so this is where I disembarked. This is where I was going with my ticket. I contacted a British cargo ship line and was able to book a passage on a freighter, on a cargo ship from here to Australia. when I got to Singapore, I told them I was en route to Bangkok, because I didn't know where the hell I was going to go. And I got a 14 days visa. Luckily, I was out by the end of 3 days after shopping and wandering around the streets. I stayed in the Chinese YMCA. One of the seamen on the freighter told me that's a good place to stay. I stayed at the Chinese YMCA, which was interestingly in the Indian section of Singapore. And this simply shows you a Hindi temple that was right down the street from the YMCA. This is back in the good old colonial days. Some of you may be familiar with the Raffles Hotel in Singapore. That's where the Singapore sling was invented. For those of you who were drinking fancy cocktails in the 50s and 60s, Singapore sling was probably high on your list. This is where it was born. This is a street scene in Singapore, typical street. There's people wandering around going about their business. One of the things that was there, I was there in early December, and it was winter monsoon season. And so every day about noon, the skies would open and everybody would seek shelter under an umbrella or an awning, and then go about their ways. When I left Singapore, I left on a British cargo liner. Cargo liners predominantly, as the name implies, carry cargo, but they could also carry up to 90 passengers. And so I was a passenger, and this is the ship, the Blue Funnel Line, took Karen, that took me to Australia. Here's Australia. It's a big place. And I'll just say that I started out on the west, traveled across all the way through the desert to the east, as you'll see in a minute. Then went up the east coast as far as Brisbane, back down the east coast, and then back to Perth, Fremantle. Our first stop in Australia was up on the west coast, a place called Broome. And Broome is famous because it has the second highest tidefall compared to the Bay of Fundy. Bay of Fundy is the greatest. Broome is the second. It's a desert place, and I'm just showing two pictures to show the waterfront. We were told we could swim, but it wasn't an area that was small and marked up because they had poisonous sea snakes there. Well, when the tide goes out, here's what happens to a ship. The ships that stop there have to be specially built to go on that run. And basically, when the tide goes out, your ship sits there, you can walk around and collect meat, marine life, and so on. Then wait for the tide to go back up to leave. So we left and went to Fremantle, which is the port for West Australia, the port for Perth. And there I began my real Australian adventure. This shows you Western Australia. We started out up here in Broome, and we're now down here in Perth, and we're going to go around Perth, and then we're going to go this way and go across off to Eastern Australia. This is downtown Perth, 1962. One of the things that struck me about Perth that was interesting was that it was a place where men's shirts, which were white, turned gray because of the number of flies on them. I got there in December of 1962. This was right after the Commonwealth Games had gotten out. And they had gotten rid of the flies for the Commonwealth Games. The Commonwealth Games are the British equivalent of the Olympics. Well, there was a problem. I mean, the flies were one thing, but I decided to look for a job. I mean, first, a lovely city. I decided to look for a job. Well, timing is everything, because everybody who'd been working on the Commonwealth Games was looking for a job at the same time I was. And so I got there, things were quiet at Christmas. I hung around. Luckily, I had met a family on the ship down. They invited me to stay with them until the Christmas holidays. I stayed with them. They left to the south or someplace, I can't remember And I ended up going to the YMCA in Perth. I stayed in a lot of YMCAs. Well, the YMCA was an interesting story because I was staying there, went out one evening, went to a coffee shop or coffee house. I was into folk music at the time, went to a coffee house and met some girls. And I didn't make it home that night. So when I got home the next morning, I found that all my stuff in my room in the YMCA had been put out in the hall because I hadn't paid my rent for that night, or the next night. And my room was then occupied by a fellow from England, a guy named Tom Silvey. And Tom and I got to be mates. And I spent about the next 5 weeks, wandering around Perth, trying to find a job, and hanging out on the beach. Well, it turned out, as well as being bad timing, I basically had no qualifications to work in Australia. I was 23 years old, I had 2 years of college, I had 5 years of medical hospital experience, but I didn't have a trade. I should say at that time, a lot of people traveled to Australia with assisted passage. They migrated with assisted passage. I did not. I paid my way. So I had no obligation. But I couldn't find a job. And so I looked for a job, and then I found out, well, it's kind of nice to hang out with the girls and go to the beach and so on. But then I decided it was time to go out east and see if I had any better luck there. So Tom and I set off to go east. We hitchhiked. We hitchhiked from Perth to Coolgardie. That was our first stop. Here is beautiful town, Coolgardie. Off to the left, off to your left, behind those trees was the city park. We stayed there that night and wandered off to a pub. As I said, that's a cultural center of Australia at the time. Things are much better now, but it was quite important. Well, from Coolgardie, we continued east to a place called Norseman. Now, if you think Coolgardie's nowhere, wait till you get to Norseman. Norseman's on the edge of the Nullarbor Desert. And you can see this is beautiful downtown Norseman. And here's where we lived. We camped out beside the road. We built this shelter out of eucalyptus branches. That's Tom, if you don't recognize me without the beard, and 60 years younger. That's me. You can see there I have posted an American flag on the top. This became a little American outpost. I found it was helpful to travel in Australia as an Australian, as an American. Anyhow, so there's my gear. That's what I traveled with, was a backpack. I had that and a Pan Am flight bag. Remember the old flight bags? When I left home, I had my ticket and $3,200. And I had my ticket to Singapore. So I needed to find a job. Well, let me say that there's not a lot of traffic that goes across the Nullarbor. There certainly wasn't then. We waited 3 days for a ride. The third day, Tom says, bugger this, I'm going back to Perth. I've got a job there waiting for me. And so I sat on the edge of the desert, and a couple of Australian surfers who were on their way from Perth back to Sydney came by. To make a long story short, after 3 days, the three of us got a ride on the back of a flatbed truck. These are people who had a caravan, they had their trailer on the truck. Lovely couple, but they took the three of us on the truck. This is January. This is January in Australia. 110, 115 degrees during the day, and we're riding on the back of this truck. Well, that hat blew off someplace about 75 miles down the road. So I used to tie a t-shirt around my head. So here's where we're going. We're going, you see the map on the left says the Nullarbor Plain. I'm going from Norseman, where we're camped out, major town Ceduna, We'll see a couple spots along the way. I'm going to Adelaide to see some friends there. Off we went. We had food, water, of course, to carry us through. And here's what it looked like. Now, the thing that was nice was that in preparation for the Commonwealth Games, they paved 75 miles of the road from Norseman to the east. The other 1,300 miles of it was dirt. And so here's the null of our plane. Here's the null of our highway. And we basically drove across that, stopped to camp at night. And interestingly, they have flies in the desert too. And it doesn't take very long for you, if you stop and start to cook some dinner, the flies come, and you develop the Australian way. Constantly, your waves to keep the flies out of your face. So we came to the bustling town of Eucla. This is the old telegraph station that was taken over. This is on the Australian Bight. This is the old town. And you can see the telegraph stations were taken over by sand. And you can see the signpost. Remember, I started in Perth. That was 1,435 miles back. And I'm on my way to Adelaide, which is 1,268 miles to go. So I got to Adelaide. The family, they dropped me off. I hitchhiked the final 75, 80 miles down into Adelaide. Got to Adelaide. And I had met a couple from Adelaide on the ship down from Singapore, and they invited me to stop off with them. Adelaide, at that time, was called the City of Churches. You can see a monument there. That's Light's monument. That's Light's vision. And the city of Adelaide is laid out here. Well, I wasn't really going to Adelaide. I was stopping off in Adelaide. I was going to Sydney or Melbourne or someplace. I wasn't sure. Those are places I'd never heard of. And I stopped off with this family, and I happened to be looking at the newspaper, looking for a job. And I saw a job for a medical orderly at the Royal Adelaide Hospital. I thought, well, what the hell, why not stay in Adelaide? And so I applied for the job, got it. I lived with the family at first in a seaside town called Glenelg. And I took the tram from Glenelg into beautiful downtown Adelaide to Royal Adelaide Hospital. I stayed with them for a few weeks and then got digs in town. But I can tell you that the experience I had, both as a technician and as an orderly in this country, had not prepared me to be a medical orderly in Australia. The large building that you see in the background there was called the Grey Ward. It had recently opened. At this time, they said that the Royal Adelaide Hospital was the largest hospital in the Southern Hemisphere. And my job, I worked in an acute injury, quadriplegic and paraplegic ward. My job, along with my mates, and a Greek and an Italian, the three of us worked together most shifts, was to turn patients. That's what we did. You had to turn patients every 4 hours so they didn't get bed sores. So that was my job. Interestingly, they had a crazy system at the time. I can't imagine anybody survived a long time. You work shifts. Well, you work a week of days, had 2 days off, worked a week of evenings, 2 days off, worked a week of nights, 2 days off, and basically I never knew whether I was eating or sleeping. It was less than pleasant. Well, there were some pleasant things about Adelaide. The friends that I stayed with had a cousin who was a very attractive young woman. We met early in my stay there, and I fell in love. And here's this American hitchhiking across, stops off in Adelaide. This girl came from a very old South Australian family. South Australia was not a convict state, by the way. It was settled by people, and she came from a very nice family. She was a student nurse, interestingly. and a couple of times we ended up in shift together, which was pretty amazing when you think about the size of this hospital. That didn't always go well. But this is the river behind the hospital where we used to go for walks. And the university's there and the South Australian Museum as well. Well, to make a long story short, she decided that the idea of being in love with an American wasn't that great an idea, and her mother thought even less of it. And so she said, we're done. Well, about the same time, the hospital said, we don't want you here anymore either. This could be a country and western song, but a dog ran off with the pickup truck. So I decided, things just weren't all that great. So I decided to shoot through. I decided that I tried Australia. I couldn't get a good job. And so I decided, okay, let's leave Adelaide, and let's go try to visit some other parts of Australia. So I took off. My friends took me out to Murray Bridge, and I started hitchhiking. And so I went up the Murray River, Mildura, and then you can see that the Mirrumbidgee River breaks off from the Murray. I went along the Mirrumbidgee to Sydney, and then on from there. But so this is where I started. Here's a typical town. This is the Murray in Mildura. Here you see a typical country town, booming, Woolworth, and this is downtown Mildura. They have great names in Australia. It's like a Walla Walla. They like so much they named it twice. Well, this is Wagga Wagga, Main Street, and you can see the cars, particularly the ones down in the lower right. Those are the all-Australian car, the Holden, and they took great pride that the Holden was the all-Australian car. Well, it was owned by GM, but that was the national car. I assume they're probably still in business. So from Wagga Wagga, I went to Sydney, stayed at the YMCA in Sydney, ran into a backpacker that had gotten off the ship in Broome. It's a small world, even in Australia, even then. This is the famous Sydney Harbour Bridge, what it looked like in the 1960s. And here is probably the most famous Sydney landmark. This is the Opera House, and the construction. As I say, we're in 1963. I left Adelaide in April, and so this was late fall in 1963. Well, it was fall, but the beaches are great. And so, we're now talking other Australian culture. Beaches, Bondi Beach is very famous, a lot of surfer movies and so on. So I spent some time in Sydney. In addition to this guy that I had met in Broome, I ran into my former mate from Adelaide in Sydney as well. There's a guy named Lionel. Lionel and I had both worked at the Royal Adelaide Hospital. He'd been a porter. Now, a porter is a step down from an orderly. Porters basically push patients around. They're the guys that push the gurneys and the wheelchairs and stuff like that. Well, one day Lionel and I were riding on the elevator together, and he looked at me and says, "You don't look like you belong here, mate." And I said, "No, I don't, mate." I had a pretty good Australian accent by that time. And so we struck up a friendship, and that actually continued for 60 years, 50 years. So anyhow, I went into Lionel in Sydney, and he was going to work in Sydney. He went to work in an operating room at the hospital there. And then I took off and traveled some more. But again, as I say, it's an awfully small world. Now, okay, so Bondi, I stayed in Sydney for about 5 or 6 days, and then decided that, I had enough excitement, girls and beaches and stuff like that. I needed to take off. So I went up north, and I went from Sydney up to Brisbane on that interior route, the dash line, and then stayed in Brisbane a while, and then went back to Sydney on the coast route. I'm hitchhiking all this time, by the way. And I got a ride into Armadale in an ambulance that had just taken a patient to one of the major hospitals someplace south, and they took me in Armadale. We got there late at night, and I decided I really wasn't interested in trying to find a place to camp out or sleep by the road. So they said, before the button, I said, well, why don't we take you to the jail and see if they'll let you stay in the jail? Which they did. So I spent the night in the Armadale jail. Luckily, they let me out the next morning, and I took off and then hitchhiked the rest of the way to Brisbane. This is Brisbane. It's a beautiful city, tropical city. One of the things that struck me most, I don't have a picture of here, is I went to the University of Queensland and had poinsettias, all landscaping and poinsettias like we have plants here. And I thought that was pretty striking. That was the furthest north I made. And if we go back to look at the Australian map, you'll see that Queensland's really not very far north. I mean, there's a lot of stuff north of there. And, the Barrier Reef, for example, Great Barrier Reef, Cooktown and Townsville, and a lot of places where they're kind of the end of the world. If you go to the end of the world in the end of the world country of Australia, you go to Townsville, which is kind of up where people live on the beach. Well, this is the Botanical Garden in Brisbane, just one of the highlights there. But close to Brisbane is the Australian Gold Coast, and this is a town called Surfers Paradise. Well, this was in the winter, so there wasn't a lot of surfing action, but it was still kind of a booming surf town. I had some acquaintances there, family members of my friends in Adelaide that I stayed with, and then I also stayed with them when I went back to Sydney. First time I went to stay, second time with family. So they took me to Surfers Paradise. They also took me to a bird sanctuary. And Australia has lots. We're not the wildlife part. Australia has lots and lots of colorful birds. These are lorikeets. You hold a pan of corn in your hand and you're covered with birds like this. Speaking of birds, I have to tell you two funny stories from when I first got to Perth. The first night, I was out in a suburb called Doubleview, staying with his family, and we went out on the veranda fence or a screen porch, and I heard a kookaburra. And I thought, my God, I'm in Australia. And so that was pretty cool. The uncool thing I did with the bird in West Australia is I went into a pet shop, and they had this gray and pink bird in a cage, and I said, oh, what's that? I said, that's a galah. Well, that's kind of like asking what a crow is. It's kind of like, man, you got to be a dumb American, because that's a very common bird, and everybody knows where it is. But speaking of common, no one had ever heard the name Lowell. I mean, I have enough trouble around here. Nobody in Australia, as far as I ever heard, understood the name Lowell or could pronounce it. And so I became Sam. Or the night nursing sister Royal Adelaide used to call me Hank the Yank. But mostly I went by Sam. And I continue to be Sam for my Australian friends for forever. Anyhow, so that's a bird story. So I went back to Sydney and then went from Sydney to Canberra, which, as probably all of you know, since you're highly educated, that's the capital of Australia. They couldn't, it's kind of like Olympia. Well, we can't make it Seattle, we can't make it Tacoma, let's make it someplace else. Well, in Australia, they couldn't make it Sydney, they couldn't make it Melbourne, so let's kind of put it in the middle. And that's Canberra. So here's Canberra. It's just kind of a made-up city. It was basically at that time the capital. That's about all that was there. Here you can see some of the Capitol buildings. Stayed in Canberra like I think a day. Can't remember. They didn't have a youth hostel there, so I probably stayed in the hotels, pubs. I stayed in a few of those, but I did more camping out than YMCA's than anything else. But mostly camped out. From Canberra, I went to Melbourne. Melbourne is the second big city in Australia. This is the route that I took, and I went through places like Albury. You can see Wagga Wagga, where we were before, up at the top there, Wangaratta, and here is a shot of beautiful Wangaratta. Another couple of examples of the All-Australian car, the Holden. And I was lucky there that I had contacts with a family. I'll go back to stuff. A friend of mine, a girlfriend of mine who worked at the hospital with me, she and her girlfriend had taken off on a cruise around the world on the Orient line a year before I left. And they had stayed in Australia, and they met a family in Wagga Wagga, or Wangaratta, who they said, well, look them up. And so I went there and I stayed about a week. And that was great because I got to visit a couple of major big stations. But the other thing I got to do was to go up into the mountains, to Mount Kosciuszko. Well, this is my vision of Australia from the Sundowners movie. You know, that, and of course, that. You know, you got, if somebody talks about Australia, you got to see some kangaroos. Well, I saw kangaroos all over. Well, you know, they aren't, I can tell you, even then, we're not bouncing down the street in Sydney. People have that idea that, you know, it's kind of like you got kangaroos in the streets of Australia. Well, you don't. And probably even less now. But they're all over. When I crossed the Nullarbor, we saw lots of kangaroos. We saw lots of emu. I think, if I remember, one wombat, which is a nocturnal animal. It's kind of like the possum where it's dead by the side of the road. You know, they come out at night and get run over. And driving across, I can tell you, driving across the Nullarbor at night is not recommended because of it's a desert, but there's a lot of critters out there. And we also saw a wild camel in the, I think either late 1800s or early 1900s. It might have been actually after the First War. The British got a bunch of camels from Afghanistan because they thought they would be good perhaps in the desert. And it didn't work out, but they managed to make little baby camels. And so there are now wild camels out in Western Australia. Well, not so wildlife, but animals are something else that's ubiquitous in Australia, and that's sheep. And this is close actually to where the kangaroos were, but these are sheep grazing. And so from there, I go to Melbourne. This is downtown Melbourne. In those days, all the cities had trams. So you can see here trams in downtown Melbourne. This is the Flinders Street railway station. This is where I stopped hitchhiking. This is where I took a train from Melbourne back to Adelaide. When I got back to Adelaide, I had packed up all my stuff. When I traveled, I only had the backpack. Well, I can tell you that when you live someplace for 3 months or 4 months, and you have to have something other than the clothes to hitchhike in, I had accumulated a wardrobe. It wasn't that great, but I had a wardrobe and some souvenirs. So I had a suitcase, and I got the suitcase, packed it up, and off we went to the train, like this. Speaking of birds, I have to tell you 2 funny stories from when I first got to Perth. The first night, I was out in a suburb called Doubleview, staying with his family, and we went out on the veranda fence or a screen porch, and I heard a kookaburra. And it was, I thought, my God, I'm in Australia. So that was pretty cool. The uncool thing I did with the bird in West Australia is I went into a pet shop, and they had this gray and pink bird in a cage. And I said, "Oh, what's that?" I said, "That's a galah." Well, that's kind of like asking what a crow is. You know, it's kind of like, man, you got to be a dumb American because you know that's a very common bird, and everybody knows what it is. But speaking of common, no one had ever heard the name Lowell. I mean, I have enough trouble around here. Nobody in Australia, as far as I ever heard, understood the name Lowell or could pronounce it. And so I became Sam. Or the nursing sister, the night nursing sister at Royal Adelaide used to call me Hank the Yank. But mostly I went by Sam. And I continued to be Sam for my Australian friends for forever. Anyhow, so that's a bird story. So I went back to Sydney and then went from Sydney to Canberra, which, as probably all of you know, since you're highly educated, that's the capital of Australia. They couldn't, it's kind of like Olympia. Well, we can't make it Seattle, we can't make it Tacoma, let's make it someplace else. Well, in Australia, they couldn't make it Sydney, they couldn't make it Melbourne, so let's kind of put it in the middle. And that's Canberra. So here's Canberra. It's just kind of a made-up city. It was basically, at that time, the capital. That's about all that was there. Here you can see some of the Capitol buildings. Stayed in Canberra, like I think a day. I can't remember. They didn't have a youth hostel there, so I probably stayed in the hotels, pubs. I stayed in a few of those, but I did more camping out in YMCA's than anything else, but mostly camped out. From Canberra, I went to Melbourne. Melbourne is the second big city in Australia. This is the route that I took, and I went through places like Albury. You can see Wagga Wagga, where we were before, up at the top there, Wangaratta, and here is a shot of beautiful Wangaratta. Another couple of examples of the all-Australian car, the Holden. And I was lucky there that I had contacts with a family. I'll go back to Steph. A friend of mine, a girlfriend of mine who worked at the hospital with me, she and her girlfriend had taken off on a cruise around the world on P&O Orient line a year before I left. And they had stayed in Australia, and they met a family in Wagga Wagga, or Wangaratta, who they said, well, look them up. And so I went there and I stayed about a week. And that was great because I got to visit a couple of major big stations. But the other thing I got to do was to go up into the mountains, to Mount Kosciuszko. Well, this is my vision of Australia from the Sundowners movie. You know, that, and of course, that. You know, if somebody talks about Australia, you got to see some kangaroos. Well, I saw kangaroos all over. Well, you know, they aren't. I can tell you, even then, we're not bouncing down the street in Sydney. People have that idea that, you know, it's kind of like you got kangaroos in the streets of Australia. Well, you don't. And probably even less now. But they're all over. When I crossed the Nullarbor, We saw lots of kangaroos. We saw lots of emu. I think, if I remember, one wombat, which is a nocturnal animal. It's kind of like the possum where it's dead by the side of the road. They come out at night and get run over. And driving across, I can tell you, driving across the middle of our night is not recommended because of it's desert, but there's a lot of critters out there. And we also saw a wild camel in the, I think either late 1800s or early 1900s. It might have been actually after the First War. The British got a bunch of camels from Afghanistan because they thought they would be good perhaps in the desert. And it didn't work out, but they managed to make little baby camels. And so there are now wild camels out in Western Australia. Well, not so wildlife, but animals are something else that's ubiquitous in Australia, and that's sheep. And this is close actually to where the kangaroos were, but these are sheep grazing. And so from there, I go to Melbourne. This is downtown Melbourne. In those days, all the cities had trams. So you can see here trams in downtown Melbourne. This is the Flinders Street railway station. This is where I stopped hitchhiking. This is where I took a train from Melbourne back to Adelaide. When I got back to Adelaide, I had packed up all my stuff. When I traveled, I only had the backpack. Well, I can tell you that when you live someplace for 3 months or 4 months, and you have to have something other than the clothes to hitchhike in, I had accumulated a wardrobe. It wasn't that great, but I had a wardrobe and some souvenirs. So I had a suitcase, and I got the suitcase, packed it up, and off we went to the train. And then I'm going to go from Adelaide to Perth, and I'm going to stay in Perth a while, but then I'm going to get on a ship. So when I'm in Adelaide, I'm getting my stuff here ready to go on the train, and I decided hitchhiking across the Nullarbor once was more than enough. So I took the train back across. I took the Trans-Australian Railway, and here you can see the train tracks. It goes straight for hundreds of miles. And I got back to Fremantle, back to Perth, hung out with the girls for a few days, and got on this ship and sailed for Europe. This is the Lord Triestino. This is the MV Neptunia. This is a real ship, not a cargo liner, not afraid of a passenger ship. Well, there were 3 classes of passengers on the Neptunia. There was first class, and there was second class, and then there was the dormitory. And I was in the dormitory. This was 20 beds, bunk beds. The majority of the passengers on the Neptunia were Italian and Yugoslav peasants, people who had been working in Australia, going back home. And let's just say that their hygiene wasn't necessarily all the best. So next week, God willing and the computer not cracking out, I will talk about what happened after I got on the ship, where I went, where I ended up, and then how I finally found my way home. So thank you.
Does anyone have questions, comments for Lowell?
I'll be glad to try to answer any comments, or if you want to give a little lecture.
I have a nephew-in-law who is a pilot for Singapore Airlines, and their training site was a few hundred miles east of Perth where there was nothing you could hit.
There's a lot of nothing there. It's called the Outback. You know, I did not make it. I did not make it to Northern Australia. When I left Adelaide, they had floods, and Lake Eyre, which was a salt bed lake like the Great Salt Lake, with literally no water, had flooded, and the roads were flooded. So I didn't go to Darwin or to Uluru or up Alice Springs up north. But yeah, there's a lot of nothing. I mean, on the Nullarbor, when I went across, there was a 75 miles of pavement outside of Norseman. There was 1,300 miles of dirt road, and there was a fence at the South Australian, West Australian line that kept the dingoes. I can't remember which side they were keeping them out of. But there's a lot of nothing. Up in the north, they have road trains where they'll have just strings of containers behind the diesel engine. You're mentioning Qantas Airlines. I might mention that.
He mentioned Singapore.
Oh well.
But Qantas.
Okay, Qantas, Singapore, Ubudui. I never flew. I traveled around the world and was never on an airplane. And it wasn't purposeful, but you got to remember when this was. This was 1962. We didn't have credit cards. We didn't have Wi-Fi. I think the telephone had been invented. but I mean, you know, some of you traveled when you were younger. Remember American Express credit or travel checks? That's what you had. Where'd you get your mail? American Express. When I left, I had a couple $100 in travel checks. And then when I worked in Australia, I did get paid. Not a lot, but I did get paid. So I was able to support some and made some money there enough to get out. But you know, the way I handled my finances was I had my father send me money. Get an American Express check out of my account and mail it to me in the American Express. Sometimes that works better than others. The next week I'll tell you one time when it didn't work so well. But anyhow, that's you know, my trip. In anticipation of it, I sold my car and started saving. And when I left, as I said, I had $3,200 to end the ticket to Singapore, and no airlines. Any other questions?
This is Judy.
This is sort of a big question. I think most of us have traveled or lived in other countries. But I reflect what I have learned from travel. And so that's a huge question. But is there anything that you can generalize about? And I'll tell you what I've learned, but...
Well, do you want to tell me what you learned, or do you want to hear what I've learned?
There are good people everywhere.
Yes.
And the kindness of strangers. That's one of the big things I've learned.
I learned that the smartest thing I've ever done in my life, other than marry Susan, was to travel around the world. I mean, when I think about it, I grew up in Wenatchee. Before I went on my trip, I'd been in 3 states. Before, I guess, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, California. I've been to Vancouver because I used to race cars, so we'd go up to Vancouver. I spent a lot of time in Vancouver. I had never been anywhere. And here's this kid from Wenatchee gets on a freighter down here in the port of Seattle with a one-way ticket to Singapore. Now, I give my parents a lot of credit. I really do. They didn't want me to do that. They didn't want me to go to Australia and say, I'm not coming back. You know, they wanted me to go to college. Well, it didn't work. It finally worked later, but I'll tell you that story too. Anyway, yeah. But the thing you learn from traveling is to be accepting, and to realize that there are good people everywhere. But you also have to realize the other side of that, there are bad people everywhere. And you need to be careful. I have never been mugged, but I've had my pocket picked, I've stolen. I've had some bad experiences hitchhiking, as you might imagine. I'll tell you about one of those next week. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, my second
Oh,
question was,
Pam,
what do you tell your grandchildren?
what do I tell my
What have you
grandchildren?
told your grandchildren when they were young?
What
about travel?
what I told my children, do it.
What?
Both,
They did.
do it. Both of my kids have been to Australia. Both of my kids have traveled in Europe. My son's been to South Africa.
Both to Australia.
Both to Australia, yeah. I tell them do it. I mean, probably everybody in this room has traveled.
Yeah.
There's nothing like it, you know. And luckily I was able to do that when I was young. There was a long time that I didn't travel. When I came back and came to the University of Washington, and then went to and studied British archaeology in Oxford in the summer of 1965. I never traveled internationally again after that for, I don't know, 25, 30 years.
Pam has some.
Our
Oh.
Australian has.
Yeah.
Well, Australia.
Yeah, I'm not making any comments except to remind everybody 1962 was a long time ago and Australia is a little different now. But I did want to say that my husband and I left Sydney in 1963 by ship. We went around the south of Australia to Perth through the Suez Canal to Italy, and we sailed on the Neptunia.
Oh, you did? Oh, wow. Oh, what fun. Yeah. Well, I wonder, you went what year?
1963, February 1963.
I went in July of 1963. So you went through the Red Sea in the winter. I went through the Red Sea in the summer. But I took the same route you did, only I got on the Fremont. Yeah. Interesting.
How long did this adventure take?
Well, altogether about 17 months. Almost a year and a half. I was gone all of 1963, and I came back in the spring of '64. I spent seven months in Australia. It took a month to get there, or 28 days to get to Singapore, and then about 7 months altogether in Australia. Anything else? Yeah.
Thanks.
I just want to say, as a woman, I envy you. It occurred to me, but I never dared do it. And I wonder how many women in this room dared travel when they were in their 20s. Hello.
Oh, great bunch of hitchhiking. Great.
Well, I think that's the thing that's really changed, because I follow several travel websites in Central Asia and Albania, and the number of single women who are traveling in Central Asia is pretty remarkable.
Wow.
Now, but yeah, well, I'll tell you a story next week about traveling with a woman in Europe. There are some adventuresome women out there. I'll tell you, anywhere you go in the world, then and still now, you will find Australians. You know, I mean, it was part of the tradition. The tradition at the time that I was there, and Pam, I hope you really understand that I'm making clear that this is not the way Australia is now. But when I was in Australia, it was typical for anybody in the upper class to go to London. Go to London and work in London, then go back to Australia and get married. And I met the people I stayed with in Adelaide had done that. They had done the overland trip. They had driven from London to Bombay, through Afghanistan, through Iran, across the Khyber Pass, and into India and into Bombay. And that was not that atypical of people of the upper classes. Not necessarily to do the overland trip, but when I ended up in London, I hung out. I had enough of an Australian accent that I could travel in Australia, and I hung out with a lot of Australians in England. Yeah.
Well, you added about people going to London and coming back and getting married. When I worked for the airline, I also knew that most of the English would put their kids on an airplane alone to fly to London for school. They come back at Christmas, and go back to London, and come back home, and it was always unaccompanied.
Yeah, I didn't encounter that so much.
Well, you didn't fly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They put your kid under that shooting, I'll see you in Sicily.
Can't get lost
A
if you're flying.
month later, yeah.
My mother, who was raised probably in the 20s and 30s, I think there are a lot of people whose relatives in the 20s and 30s in upper class went to Europe.
Yeah, you did the grand
So
tour.
she went to Italy and lived in Italy.
Yeah.
And that influenced our whole family. And then when I was 15, my parents took us to Europe and we went on the Ile de France.
Yeah.
And that was in 1950 something.
Well, it was because the grand tour started with Brits going to the continent, and then, Americans picked up on it. But the grand tour, you certainly went to Rome.
I never.
You didn't go to Rome, well, you missed a great experience. Roger, tell her about Rome.
Well, Roger has told us about Rome. If you have more, I'd be happy to put you up here again. That's it for this week. Thank you.